My evil mother-in-law demanded a DNA test on my baby. It exposed her 40-year-old secret. She called my son a bastard at his christening, but karma revealed the real cheater in the family. I used one DNA test to destroy my trifling mother-in-law and inherit her husband's entire fortune. The DNA test destroyed her. The air in that dining room was so thick with unspoken hatred you could have spread it on a cracker. It was a silence that had weight, a physical entity pressing down on my shoulders, making the fine silk of my Tom Ford dress feel like a suit of armor I'd polished for war. The scent of roasted duck with a cherry reduction, a meal that I knew for a fact cost more than my parents' first mortgage payment, hung in the air, a cloying, extravagant perfume for what was about to become a funeral. Nobody was eating. The crystal wine glasses, filled with a Bordeaux that was older than I was, sat sweating condensation onto the polished mahogany, untouched, like silent, glittering witnesses to a firing squad. All eyes, every single pair in that cavernous, ridiculously opulent room, were locked on the single, unassuming manila envelope I held in my hands. My fingers were steady, a surgeon's calm before the first critical incision. But inside, my heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs, desperate for release. Across the vast 10-foot expanse of that ludicrous table, my mother-in-law, Eleanor Jenkins, was practically levitating with smug anticipation. A thin, cruel little smile was painted on her perfectly lined lips, a slash of crimson in a face that was a testament to the finest plastic surgeons money could buy. She looked like a designer-clad vulture, a Gucci-wearing ghoul who had been patiently circling a wounded animal for years, just waiting for it to finally draw its last ragged breath. Her posture was ramrod straight, her chin lifted in a gesture of pure arrogance. She thought this was it. Her moment of ultimate vindication. Her final glorious checkmate in a war she had declared the very first day my husband Marcus slipped that beautiful 3-carat cushion-cut diamond on my finger. In her mind, the curtain was about to rise on her favorite play, the public humiliation of Keisha Williams Jenkins, the girl from the wrong zip code with a scholarship and too much ambition, the one she'd branded as a gold-digging fraud from day one. My husband, my sweet, hopelessly conflicted Marcus, sat beside me. His hand was a vice grip on my thigh under the table, a desperate, anchoring pressure in a raging sea. He was trying to project support, to be my rock. But the faint sheen of sweat on his brow and the nervous tick in his strong jaw told a different, more honest story. He was terrified. He loved me. I never doubted that for a single second. But a lifetime of psychological warfare under his mother's command had conditioned him to expect the worst, to always brace for her inevitable, crushing victory. He was a good man trapped in a gilded cage, and his mother held the only key. He kept clearing his throat, a small nervous sound that was swallowed by the cavernous silence of the room. And then there was my father-in-law, Robert Jenkins, Sr., a man who looked like he was personally carved from the granite of a mountain, all hard angles and quiet, immense authority. He was silent, his face a completely unreadable mask, his piercing gray eyes fixed on that envelope. This was a man who worshipped at the altar of legacy, honor, and bloodline. He spoke those words like they were sacred commandments. This entire disgusting, humiliating spectacle was only happening because Eleanor, his wife of 4 decades, had spent years whispering her venomous suspicions into his ear, a slow, steady drip of poison that had eventually eroded the well of his judgment. He hadn't wanted this dinner, this confrontation. He found it distasteful beneath the dignity of the Jenkins name. But he was a man who demanded resolution, and Eleanor had convinced him this was the only way. "Well, Keisha?" Eleanor's voice, sharp and brittle as shattered glass, sliced through the tension. It was coated in a sickly sweet layer of fake politeness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. We're all waiting. The suspense is simply killing me. Let's finally put this unpleasantness to rest, shall we? Her eyes glittered with a malicious glee that was almost pornographic. She was savoring this, rolling the moment around on her tongue like a fine wine. I raised my eyes from the envelope and met her gaze directly. I let the silence stretch, beat after agonizing beat. I wanted her to marinate in this moment. I wanted her to savor the taste of what she believed was her imminent triumph. I wanted her to feel it on her tongue, the sweet, delicious flavor of my impending destruction, because I knew with a certainty that was almost spiritual that in a few short moments, that sweetness was going to curdle and turn to pure, bitter ash in her mouth, a poison of her own making. Girl, let me tell you, the devil works hard. But on that particular Friday night, I was his damn CEO. To understand how we got here to this $1 million dining room on the verge of a hostile takeover, I have to take you back. Not just a few months, but all the way back to the beginning, before the name Jenkins meant anything to me, but a brand of cheap gin my uncle used to drink. I met Marcus in our final year at Howard University. I wasn't there looking for a husband. Lord knows I didn't have the time. I was there on a full academic scholarship, staring down a future I was determined to forge for myself, brick by single, hard-earned brick. My family was rich in love, but that was the only currency we had in abundance. My mother was a registered nurse who worked double shifts that left her bone tired but never broke her spirit, and my father was the best mechanic in 3 counties, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease but whose heart was pure gold. They worked themselves to the bone to make sure my brother and I never went without the important things. Food on the table, books for school, and unconditional love, but there was no trust fund, no summer home in Martha's Vineyard. My inheritance was a spine made of steel and a work ethic that wouldn't quit. Marcus was different. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that was at odds with the Patek Philippe watch that occasionally peeked out from his cuff. It wasn't arrogance. It was a deep-seated calm, as if he knew the world was a complicated place, but wasn't particularly worried by it. He had a kindness in his eyes that seemed almost out of place in a world I knew to be sharp and competitive. We first really spoke in our macroeconomic seminar. The professor posed a question about emerging market debt, and I gave my answer, all data and theory. Then Marcus spoke, agreeing with my points, but adding this layer of humanistic concern, talking about the real world impact on the people in those countries. He wasn't just smart, he was wise. After class, he caught up to me. That was a brilliant analysis, Keisha, he said, his smile genuine. You see the machine, not just the numbers. And he had this laugh, a little too goofy and unrestrained for his handsome face, that made me smile every time I heard it. He never once bragged about his family's wealth. In fact, he seemed almost embarrassed by it, changing the subject whenever it came up. He was just Marcus, the guy who looked at me, Keisha Williams, like I was the only person in a crowded room, like what I had to say was the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. We fell in love the way you read about in books, slowly, thoughtfully, and then all at once in a dizzying, breathtaking rush. Our first date was coffee at a little shop off campus that turned into a 6-hour conversation. It was a crisp autumn day, and the air smelled of roasted coffee and fallen leaves. We sat outside, huddled over our steaming mugs, and talked about everything and nothing, our dreams, our fears, our favorite 90s R&B groups. He confessed his secret love for old kung fu movies. I confessed my terror of public speaking. For 2 years, it was pure, it was real, and it was blissfully perfect. We built our own little world, a world built on mutual respect, intellectual sparring, and a love so deep it felt like coming home. He'd come over to my tiny off-campus apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the temperamental radiator, and he'd look more at home there than I'd ever seen him look in photos of his family's palatial estate. He loved my mom's cooking, listened to my dad's stories about carburetors for hours, and treated my family with a respect that was so genuine it brought tears to my eyes. Then came the inevitable, meeting the parents. The first time I drove up the winding tree-lined driveway to the Jenkins estate in Potomac, Maryland, I was convinced my beat-up little Honda's GPS had finally given up the ghost and sent me to the White House by mistake. It wasn't a house. It was a compound. A sprawling, white-pillared Georgian mansion that looked like it had been plucked from a movie set, sitting on what felt like 100 acres of perfectly manicured green lawn. My little Civic seemed to shrink in shame as I parked it between a gleaming black Bentley and a vintage silver Aston Martin. I suddenly felt like my sensible dress was a costume and I was an imposter about to be found out. Marcus squeezed my hand, sensing my sudden terror. "Don't be nervous. They're going to love you." Oh, bless his sweet, naive heart. He had no idea what we were walking into. He saw his parents through the filter of love. I was about to see them with the clarity of an outsider. Mr. Jenkins Robert was formal but not unkind. He shook my hand, his grip firm and dry, his eyes assessing me with the shrewd calculation of a CEO considering a major acquisition. He was intimidating, a man who radiated power without saying a word, but I got the sense that he was a man of logic. If you proved your value, you earned his respect. He was a problem to be solved, not an enemy to be feared. "A pleasure to finally meet you, Keisha," he'd said, his voice a low baritone. "Marcus has spoken very highly of you." Eleanor Jenkins, however, was a creature from a different planet. She didn't walk into the grand marble-floored foyer. She glided, a silent specter of wealth and privilege. She was tall and unnervingly thin, poured into a cream-colored St. John knit suit that probably cost more than my entire college education. The air around her was thick with the scent of Chanel No. 5 and disdain. She didn't offer a hand to shake. She just looked me up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal from my sensible but stylish heels to my fresh press and curl. Her eyes lingered for a fraction of a second too long on my handbag. A perfectly nice Coach bag I'd saved for months to buy. And a tiny, almost imperceptible sneer touched her lips. It was a look that said, "How quaint, you tried." "So," she said, her voice as crisp and cold as a freshly starched shirt, "You're Keisha." It wasn't a greeting. It was an indictment. That first dinner was the beginning of a death by 1,000 cuts. Every question she asked was a carefully crafted missile designed to highlight my otherness, to paint me as an interloper from a lower caste. We sat in a dining room that could have seated 30, the table gleaming under a chandelier that looked like a cascade of frozen diamonds. "Where did you say your family was from again?" "Oh, that part of D.C. How vibrant." The implication was clear, uncivilized, loud and poor. "A full scholarship to Howard, you say? How fortunate for you." As if I hadn't earned it with a 4.0 GPA, hundreds of hours of extracurriculars, and a will of iron. She made it sound like I'd won the lottery, not achieved a goal. "Marcus tells me your mother is a nurse. Such noble, essential work. And your father?" she asked, her head tilted with a grotesque pantomime of interest. "He's a mechanic," I said, my chin held high, refusing to be shamed. "He owns his own auto shop. He's the most honest man I know and can fix anything with an engine." Eleanor just smiled, that thin viper smile. "Of course, hardworking people." The words themselves were complimentary, but her tone was dripping with the kind of condescension you use for the hired help. It was clear she was drawing a line in the sand. There were people like us, the Jenkinses in their circle, and then there were the hardworking people like my family who existed in a completely different and inferior universe. She spent the rest of the meal talking about their upcoming trip to Monaco for the Grand Prix and reminiscing about a recent art auction at Christie's where they'd acquired a de Kooning. It was a deliberate, suffocating display of a world she knew I wasn't a part of. For the next 5 years, it became Eleanor's personal holy crusade to break us up. She was a master of passive aggression, a psychological sniper. One Christmas, she forgot to invite me to the family's annual ski trip to Aspen. Marcus was furious. He called her from our apartment, his voice tight with anger. I could hear her syrupy voice through the phone. Oh, darling, it completely slipped my mind. With all the arrangements, I just assumed, well, I wasn't sure if Keisha even skied. It's such an expensive hobby. The implication was that I was too poor and uncultured to even know how. She'd buy me gifts that were subtly insulting, a high-end cookbook, to help you learn your way around a real kitchen, she'd said with a wink, as if I were a 1950s housewife in training and not a woman with a burgeoning career. Another time, for my birthday, she gave me a gift certificate to a department store that was several tiers below where she shopped. I thought you could find something more in your style there, dear, she chirped, less fussy. Her favorite narrative, the one she pushed on anyone who would listen, her friends at the country club, distant cousins, even the household staff, was that I was a classic gold digger, a parasite who had sunk her perfectly manicured claws into her precious son to secure a life of luxury I could never achieve on my own. The irony was, I was killing it in my own career. I'd been headhunted out of college by a top marketing firm in D.C., and by the time Marcus and I had been dating for 4 years, I was a junior vice president, managing multi-million-dollar campaigns for national brands. I paid my own bills. I traded in my Honda for a brand new Lexus, and I had my own growing portfolio of investments. I didn't need a dime of Jenkins' money, but none of that mattered to her. In her eyes, my success was just part of a long con, a clever performance to solidify my position before the big score. Marcus tried. He really did. He'd argue with her, defend me until he was blue in the face. But Eleanor was a black belt in emotional manipulation. She'd clutch her chest and talk about her fragile heart, burst into crocodile tears, and accuse him of choosing a stranger from the gutter over the woman who gave him life. He was caught in an impossible position, and I saw the toll it took on him, the way it carved lines of stress around his beautiful eyes. For the sake of his peace, I learned to play the game. I swallowed her insults. I smiled through the veiled digs, and I killed her with a relentless, saccharine kindness she couldn't penetrate. I figured if I was just perfect enough, just gracious enough, just undeniably successful enough, she would eventually run out of ammunition and have no choice but to wave the white flag. When Marcus proposed on a surprise trip to Paris under the sparkling lights of the Eiffel Tower, far away from her toxic orbit, I cried tears of pure, unadulterated joy. We were married in a beautiful, elegant ceremony at a vineyard in Virginia, a wedding that I insisted we pay for ourselves with our own money. Eleanor's disgust was palpable. It's so quaint, she'd sniffed, her eyes sweeping over the tastefully decorated venue as if it were a barn, almost like a little community theater production of a wedding. She said it just loud enough for my mother to overhear, a calculated cruelty that made my blood boil. My mother, a queen in her own right, simply smiled serenely and said, "Isn't it wonderful? It's all about the love, not the price tag." Eleanor looked as if she'd bitten into a lemon. Life as her daughter-in-law was just a new, more intimate level of hell. We lived in the family guest house, a stunning 3-bedroom stone cottage that was bigger than my childhood home, but I was never made to feel like anything more than a temporary tenant. Her obsession with the Jenkins name, the Jenkins legacy, the Jenkins bloodline grew more and more pronounced. It was all she talked about. How their ancestors had supposedly built their fortune from nothing, a dramatic lie I later learned through a little digging. Robert's father had invented a specific type of industrial valve that was still making them royalties, but she preferred the more romantic bootstraps narrative. The bloodline was sacred. It had to remain pure, undiluted by the likes of me. Then, after 2 long years of marriage, the miracle we had been praying for finally happened. I was pregnant, I thought, with a foolishness that now seems almost criminal, that a baby would change everything. A grandchild, the continuation of her precious sacred bloodline. How could she possibly hate the mother of her own grandbaby? For a while, it almost seemed like I was right. Eleanor's open hostility morphed into a kind of obsessive, smothering control. She dictated my diet. No spicy foods, Keisha, it's common. Critiqued my prenatal yoga. That pose looks rather undignified. And tried to install her own preferred OB-GYN, a man so old he probably delivered Moses. She bought out entire collections of designer baby clothes from Bonpoint and Jacquardi, all in shades of ecru, beige, and slate gray, of course. Jenkins babies do not wear loud, common colors, she declared, sweeping a rack of adorable, brightly colored onesies I'd bought out of the nursery with a flick of her wrist. It was infuriating, but it was a step up from outright hatred. I gritted my teeth and let her have her way, telling myself it was a small price to pay for peace. The day my son was born was, without question, the happiest day of my entire life. We named him Noah. He was absolute perfection. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a beautiful little face that was the most perfect mix of me and Marcus. He had my nose and my full lips, but he had Marcus's gentle eyes and the distinct shape of his face. His skin was a beautiful, warm caramel, a shade richer than Marcus's, a little lighter than mine. He was our son. He was a masterpiece. When Eleanor came to the hospital, she peered into the bassinet, her face a strange, unreadable mask. "He's healthy," was all she said, a clinical assessment rather than a grandmother's coup. She poked a single manicured finger towards his tiny hand, but didn't touch him. A chill went down my spine, but I dismissed it as postpartum anxiety. We decided to have his christening when he was 3 months old. We held it at the family's church, a magnificent old stone cathedral with stained glass windows that threw jewels of light across the pews. Noah, angelic in a white lace christening gown that had been in the Jenkins family for 4 generations. A gown Eleanor had presented to me with the solemnity of a coronation, slept through the whole service. I stood at the altar, holding my perfect son, with my proud husband by my side, and I felt a sense of profound peace I hadn't felt in years. I finally belonged. We were a family. The reception was held back at the main house. The place was teeming with the Jenkins circle of wealthy friends, a sea of old money, draped in discreet jewels and bespoke suits. The champagne flowed, a string quartet played Vivaldi softly in the corner, and for the first time I truly felt like the lady of the house. I was glowing radiant with happiness, chatting with guests who were finally treating me with warmth and acceptance. That's when Eleanor, holding a delicate flute of Dom Perignon, tapped a crystal glass with her fork for a toast. The room, filled with the low hum of polite chatter, fell silent. I smiled at her, my heart full, expecting a gushing, flowery speech about her beautiful new grandson. She raised her glass. "To Noah," she began, her voice ringing out with practiced clarity, "the newest addition to our family." The pause was slight, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I felt it like a cold drop of rain on my warm skin. I must say, when I look at this precious child, I am struck. She took a theatrical step closer, peering down at Noah, who was sleeping peacefully in my arms. Her eyes, cold and calculating as a loan shark's, scanned his tiny, perfect face. "He's a beautiful baby, of course," she continued, her voice now taking on a sharper, more clinical edge. The warmth in the room began to evaporate. "But one simply can't help but notice. He's quite a bit more sun-kissed than one would expect for a Jenkins. Marcus, if you recall, was such a fair baby, almost pale, and his hair, it's so dark and curly." A collective strangled gasp rippled through the room. It was so quiet you could hear the fizz of the champagne bubbles dying in their glasses. My smile froze and cracked on my face. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Mother, what in the hell are you doing?" Eleanor ignored him completely. Her eyes locked on me. The mask of civility was gone. The viper was coiled and ready to strike. "All I am saying is that the Jenkins bloodline is a very strong, very dominant one. Our features have been remarkably consistent for generations. And looking at this child, well, it raises questions. Questions of authenticity." I couldn't breathe. My lungs had seized. She was doing this here. Now. In front of our family, our friends, on the day of my son's christening, in the house I was supposed to call home. She was turning a sacred celebration into a public witch trial. "Mother, that is enough." Marcus's voice was shaking, with a rage I'd never heard from him before. "Is it, Marcus?" She shot back, finally turning her cold gaze on him. "Is it enough? This is about our legacy, your inheritance, your father's entire life's work. Before one penny of the Jenkins fortune is promised to this child, before he is officially recognized as a true heir to the Jenkins name, I believe we need proof. I demand a DNA test." The words hung in the air, ugly and radioactive. A DNA test. She had stood in a room full of people on a day meant for blessings and called my son a bastard and me a cheating, gold-digging whore. I looked down at my baby's innocent, sleeping face, and something inside me, something I had kept chained and sedated for 7 long years, finally broke free. The years of swallowing her insults, of smiling through the pain, of turning the other cheek until my neck ached, it all burned away in a flash of white-hot clarity. All that was left was a diamond-hard rage that was so pure, so absolute, it was almost serene. I lifted my head, my spine straightening into a rod of steel, and my eyes found hers across the room. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "Fine," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the stunned, silent room like a gunshot. "You want a DNA test, Eleanor? You'll get your damn DNA test." That night I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. As I sat in the soft glow of the nursery, rocking my son, my perfect, beautiful boy, my sorrow and shock cooled and hardened into something far more dangerous, a strategy. She wanted to play with fire. Fine. I was going to burn her entire world to the ground and salt the earth behind me. A simple paternity test proving Noah was Marcus's son was no longer enough. That would just be a temporary victory. She would offer a hollow, insincere apology, claim she was just a worried grandmother, and things would revert back to her slow, torturous campaign of psychological warfare. No, this was no longer about defense. This was about total annihilation. I remembered a strange comment she'd made years ago during a family dinner. A distant cousin was talking about a messy divorce, and Eleanor had scoffed. "Men are so blind, they'll believe whatever a woman tells them, especially when they're young." At the time, it seemed like a cynical remark. Now it felt like a clue, a confession almost. The next morning, fueled by black coffee and righteous fury, I went online. I didn't just order a standard over-the-counter paternity test kit. I spent 4 hours researching forensic genealogy labs, the kind law enforcement uses to solve cold cases. I found a company in Utah that offered the most comprehensive DNA and ancestry analysis on the market. It could trace bloodlines back for centuries, identify genetic markers for obscure diseases, and most importantly, perform detailed paternity and maternity verification between multiple parties with court-admissible certainty. It cost a small fortune, but money was no object. I pulled out the black Amex card that Robert had insisted I take for family emergencies. I considered this the mother of all emergencies. I ordered the full family panel. One for me, one for Noah, one for Marcus, and the masterstroke, the move she would never see coming, one for Eleanor and one for Robert. My cover story was a work of malicious genius. I would tell everyone that since Eleanor was so deeply concerned with the purity and history of the Jenkins bloodline, I thought it would be a wonderful healing family project to trace the entire lineage. We could create a beautiful, leather-bound family tree for Noah. A gift, you see, a peace offering from a gracious daughter-in-law. Let her think I was extending an olive branch while I was really sharpening an axe. Now came the hardest part. Collecting the samples. Getting a cheek swab from me and my baby was simple. Getting one from Marcus was, too. He was so consumed with guilt and fury over his mother's behavior that he would have agreed to give a lung if I'd asked. I am so sorry, Keisha, he kept saying, his eyes filled with pain. I'll get the sample for the test. We'll prove her wrong and this will all be over. It's okay, baby, I told him, kissing his cheek with a tenderness I didn't feel in that moment. My tenderness was reserved for my son, for everyone else. I was all business. Let me handle everything. I don't want you to have to engage with her at all. Getting Eleanor and Robert's DNA without their knowledge was going to require a level of cunning I didn't know I possessed. I bided my time for 2 days, letting her think I was wounded and scared. Then on Wednesday, I went over to the main house under the pretense of discussing the nursery's redecoration. Eleanor was in the sunroom reading a copy of Town and Country. She was still cold, but there was an unmistakable air of triumph about her. She thought she had me backed into a corner. Hello, Eleanor, I said, my voice as sweet as Southern iced tea. I brought you a latte. Your favorite non-fat extra foam. From the little place in the village. She eyed the cup as if it might be poisoned, then took it with a curt nod. Thank you, Keisha. I sat with her, making agonizing small talk about the weather, about the upcoming charity gala, about absolutely nothing of substance. I watched her like a hawk. I watched her take a delicate sip, leaving a perfect waxy crimson print of her expensive lipstick on the white lid. I watched her place the cup down on the glass side table. After a few more minutes of painfully polite conversation, I made my move. Well, I should get back to Noah for his feeding. I'll just take these cups to the kitchen for you. The staff can get that, she said dismissively, not even looking up from her magazine. Ooh, it's no trouble at all, I chirped, my voice sickeningly bright. I grabbed my own cup and, more importantly, hers. In the vast, silent kitchen, my heart pounding, I looked around to ensure no staff were present. I carefully twisted off the lid she had drunk from, slipped it into a Ziploc bag I had hidden in my purse, and tossed the rest of the cup into the trash. Sample 1, secured. The sheer audacity of it all made my heart pound with a thrilling, terrifying rhythm. Robert was more of a challenge, but he was also a creature of unwavering habit. Every evening at precisely 5:30 p.m., he had a glass of 18-year-old Macallan single malt scotch in his mahogany-paneled study. I went to see him that evening, using Noah as my tiny, adorable shield. I knew he had a soft spot for the baby, despite Eleanor's campaign of poison. Robert, I'm so deeply sorry about all this drama, I said, my voice full of practiced sincerity and regret. I've ordered the test. It was the comprehensive one. I thought you might appreciate the genealogical data for the family records. He just grunted, swirling the amber liquid in his heavy crystal tumbler. It's a damned mess is what it is. That woman... He shook his head, his jaw tight, not finishing the sentence. I stayed for a few minutes, letting him hold Noah. He cooed at the baby, his stern face softening in a way it never did for anyone else. It was a moment of profound, gut-wrenching irony. Here he was, holding his true-blood grandson, completely unaware of the lie he'd lived for 40 years. Then, as I was preparing to leave, I accidentally knocked a heavy leather-bound book off a side table. As I bent to retrieve it, my hand brushed against his glass, which he had just set down. With a sleight of hand that would have made a professional pickpocket proud, I ran a sterile swab concealed in my palm around the wet rim of the glass. It was damp with his expensive scotch, and more importantly, his DNA. I slipped it back into its sterile container and palmed it into my pocket. My apologies. So clumsy of me, I murmured. No harm done, he mumbled, his attention already back on a stack of financial reports. Sample 2, secured. That night after Marcus was asleep, I laid out all 5 sample kits on my bathroom counter like a scientist preparing for a breakthrough experiment. I filled out the forms, carefully labeling each vial. Under the section for relationship to be tested, I ticked all the boxes. Paternity, Noah versus Marcus. Paternity, Marcus versus Robert. Maternity, Marcus versus Eleanor. I wanted the full, unvarnished, irrevocable truth. I sealed the box, paid the extra fee for rush processing and overnight shipping, and sent my little package of social dynamite off to the lab. And then I waited. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest and most surreal of my life. I moved through my days like an actress in a play. I was the perfect wounded daughter-in-law. I was quiet, reserved, and visibly saddened. I avoided Eleanor, who seemed to be gloating more and more with each passing day. She had, of course, told her entire circle of friends about the unfortunate DNA situation, painting me as a cornered animal and her as a vigilant matriarch protecting her family. The whispers and pitying looks followed me everywhere, from the organic grocery store to the dry cleaners. Marcus was a wreck. The tension in our guest house was thick enough to choke on. He was furious with his mother, but he was also clinging to the naive hope that once the results came back, she would see the error of her ways and our family could finally heal. He didn't understand that for Eleanor, this was never about the truth. It was about power and control. I, on the other hand, felt a strange, almost zen-like calm. I had launched a missile, and all I could do now was wait for it to hit its target. I poured all my energy into my son, memorizing every curve of his face, every tiny sound he made. He was my why. He was the reason I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of our lives. I would not let his life be defined by that woman's bitterness and hatred. I would not let him grow up with the stain of her public accusations. I was his mother, and I would protect him, even if it meant becoming a monster myself to fight the one who lived in the main house. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning as I was having my second cup of coffee. The subject line was simple, but it made my heart leap into my throat. Your results are ready. My hands started to shake. I went into my home office and locked the door. My fingers fumbled as I typed in the password to the secure online portal. And there they were. 5 individual reports, all available as downloadable PDFs, each one a potential landmine. I clicked on the first one, the one that started this whole nightmare. File paternity analysis. Subject, Noah Jenkins. And alleged father, Marcus Jenkins. I held my breath, the blood roaring in my ears, and scrolled down to the conclusion. Analysis of the 24 genetic markers indicates a 99.9999% probability that Marcus Jenkins is the biological father of the child, Noah Jenkins. A wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy washed over me, not because I ever had any doubt, but because here it was. Receipt number 1, the black and white scientific proof that her entire premise, her entire war against me, was built on a foundation of pure malice. But I wasn't done. My hand, now trembling with adrenaline, moved the cursor to the next file, the one that was my wild card, my long shot, the one that could either do nothing or change the entire world. File, paternity analysis. Subject, Marcus Jenkins and alleged father, Robert Jenkins, Sr. My eyes scanned the technical jargon, the charts of alleles and loci. My heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I scrolled down past the scientific explanations to the final stark one-sentence conclusion at the bottom of page 3. Based on the genetic profiles provided, the probability of Robert Jenkins Sr. being the biological father of Marcus Jenkins is 0%. 0.0%. I read it again, and a third time. The words on the screen seemed to vibrate. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a typo. It was there in black and white, a cold, hard scientific fact. My husband of 7 years, the man whose entire identity was inextricably wrapped up in being a Jenkins, was not a Jenkins by blood at all. This meant, oh my God, this meant that Eleanor Jenkins, the grand dame of blood purity, the high priestess of the sacred Jenkins lineage, the woman who measured a person's worth by their ancestry, was a fraud, a monumental 40-year-long fraud. She hadn't just had a fling, she had gotten pregnant by another man and had passed the baby off as her husband's, raising him as the heir to a name and a fortune that were not his by her own twisted standards. Her obsession with bloodlines, her pathological hatred for me, her constant fear of being exposed, it was all projection. She wasn't worried about me diluting the bloodline. She was terrified that I would somehow uncover the fact that she had poisoned it herself decades ago. I leaned back in my leather office chair, the air rushing out of my lungs in a single sharp gasp. A slow, wicked, unfamiliar smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed the launch codes to a nuclear arsenal. Eleanor Jenkins had demanded a DNA test to check the authenticity of my son, and in doing so, she had handed me the very tool I needed to expose the inauthenticity of her own. Karma, honey, isn't just a bitch. She's a goddamn scientist with a PhD in poetic justice. It was time to set the stage for the final act. I picked up the phone and called my father-in-law's executive assistant. Hi, Sarah. It's Keisha Jenkins. I was hoping you could schedule a family dinner for this Friday night. Just the four of us. Robert, Eleanor, Marcus, and myself. I have the results, Eleanor requested, and I'd like for us to review them together so we can all finally move forward as a family. I laid the trap, and I baited it with exactly what each of them wanted to hear. Friday came faster than I expected. I dressed with military precision. A simple but devastatingly elegant, a black sheath dress by Tom Ford. Understated, powerful. I wore the diamond stud earrings Marcus had given me as a wedding gift. My hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe bun at the nape of my neck. No frills, no softness. I was going into battle. I printed out the results, not just the conclusions, but all of them. The full, multi-page reports, complete with charts and scientific explanations. I placed them in a crisp, clean manila envelope. When Marcus and I walked into the main house, the tension was a physical presence. Eleanor was preening, dressed in a gaudy emerald green caftan that screamed, "Look at me." She looked like a queen who was about to watch a public execution. Robert was stern and silent as usual, a thundercloud in a bespoke suit. We sat at that enormous mahogany table. The staff served the roasted duck. No one picked up a fork. Finally, after an excruciating silence that stretched for an eternity, Eleanor couldn't contain her glee any longer. "Well, Keisha," she said, dabbing her painted lips with a linen napkin she hadn't used, "you said you had something to share. Don't keep us in suspense." I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope, and placed it on the table with a soft but definitive thud. "Yes, Eleanor. As you so publicly demanded, I had the DNA test done," I said, my voice even and cool as a river stone. I made a point to look at Marcus, then at Robert, before letting my eyes settle on her. "You raised concerns about the Jenkins legacy, about authenticity. You wanted proof, so I thought it was best to be exceptionally thorough." I opened the unsealed flap top of the envelope and pulled out the first report. "This is the paternity analysis for my son Noah and my husband Marcus." I slid the stack of papers across the polished wood toward Eleanor. "You can read the 20 pages of technical data if you like, but I'll skip to the conclusion for you. It reads, and I quote, "Analysis of the genetic markers indicates a 99% probability that Marcus Jenkins is the biological father of the child, Noah Jenkins." I let the words hang in the dead air. Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding for 2 weeks, his shoulders slumping in relief. He squeezed my hand, a look of pure love and vindication on his face. Robert nodded once, a flicker of what looked like satisfaction in his steely eyes. Eleanor's triumphant smile faltered, collapsing for a fraction of a second. She had been so sure, so utterly convinced. She recovered quickly, forcing a brittle, high-pitched laugh. "Well," she said, her voice a little too loud. "Wonderful. I'm so glad that's cleared up. I told you, Robert, I was just being cautious. It is a mother's duty to be vigilant." "Oh, I understand completely," I said, my voice now dangerously sweet. "Your unwavering commitment to the purity of the Jenkins bloodline is truly inspiring," which is why I didn't stop there. I reached back into the envelope. Her eyes darted to my hand, and for the first time a flicker of genuine fear appeared in them, the first tiny crack in her impenetrable facade. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out the second report. My heart was a war drum in my chest. This was it, the point of no return. "You got me thinking, Eleanor, about legacy, about secrets, about the paramount importance of the whole truth." So since we were already sending samples to the lab, I took the liberty of running a more comprehensive family panel to create a full, accurate picture for Noah. "For his heritage." "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "You had no right." "I had every right," I shot back, my manufactured calm finally shattering, replaced by the righteous cold fury I had been holding in for so long. "You stood up at my son's christening in front of 200 people and called him a bastard. You questioned my honor, my fidelity, my character. You have made my life a living hell for 7 years, all in the name of a bloodline you claimed was as sacred as the Holy Grail. So yes, Eleanor, I had the right to find out just how sacred it really is." I turned my gaze to Robert, my voice softening with genuine pity. "I'm sorry, Robert. I truly am. You are a good man, and you don't deserve this. But you deserve to know the truth of the legacy you hold so dear." I slid the second report across the table to him. He picked it up, his large, capable hands trembling slightly. He put on his reading glasses. He read the first page, then the second. His eyes, which had been so hard and unreadable, widened in disbelief. He flipped to the conclusion, his mouth falling slightly open. The paper shook in his hand. Marcus, seeing the look of utter devastation on his father's face, snatched the paper from him. He read the final sentence out loud, his voice a choked, confused whisper. "The probability of Robert Jenkins, Sr. being the biological father of Marcus Jenkins is 0%. Silence. A heavy, suffocating, absolute silence that was louder than any scream. Marcus stared at the paper, then at his mother, his face a slow-motion film of confusion, morphing into dawning horror. "Mom, what is this? This has to be a mistake, right?" "It's a mistake." Eleanor went sheet white, deathly pale. The color drained from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking like a waxy yellow mask. She started to tremble violently, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped bird looking for an escape. "It's a lie." She faked it. That little gold-digging witch, she faked it to tear this family apart. But her voice was hollow. It was the shrill, panicked shriek of the guilty. Robert slowly, deliberately, placed his hands on the table and pushed himself to his feet. He was a big man, but in that moment he seemed colossal, a figure of Old Testament wrath. The look on his face was something I will never, ever forget. It was a terrifying, apocalyptic mixture of profound heartbreak and volcanic rage. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at me. His eyes, now burning like gray flames, were locked on his wife of 40 years. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dangerously, unnaturally quiet. "Tell me it's a lie." "Robert, darling, you can't believe this trash," she stammered, trying to stand, to go to him to work her old magic. "I have known you for 41 years, he said, each word a chip of ice. I know all your tales. I know when you're lying. Your left eye twitches. It's twitching right now. She froze, her hand flying to her eye as if to physically stop it. 39 years, Robert whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow, making him stagger slightly. 39 years you let me raise another man's son. You let me give him my name, my legacy. He slammed his fist on the table with such force that, for the first time in his life, I saw Marcus flinch away from the man he thought was his father. The crystal glasses jumped and red wine sloshed onto the pristine white tablecloth like spreading bloodstains. Who was he, Eleanor? He roared, the sound seeming to shake the very foundation of the mansion. Eleanor finally broke, collapsing into ugly, desperate sobs. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake. I was lonely. You were always working, always traveling. The excuses were pathetic. They were gasoline on a raging inferno. Robert just stared at her, his face turning from red-hot rage to ice-cold stone. The anger seemed to drain away, replaced by something much colder, much more final. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. She stopped crying, her head snapping up. "What?" I said. "Get out," he repeated, his voice like the closing of a vault door. "Pack your things. I want you out of my house. Tonight." "Robert, you can't," she shrieked, a new wave of panic in her voice. "Where will I go? This is my home." This was never your home, sis," he said coldly, his voice dripping with contempt. "Oh, it was just a place you lived while you built a throne of lies. You dare to speak to me of bloodlines? You have tainted mine with the ultimate betrayal." He then turned to Marcus, and for the first time, I saw tears welling in the old man's eyes, cutting clean tracks through his stony facade. "Son, Marcus, He couldn't finish. The pain was too immense, too raw. Marcus was catatonic, staring into the middle distance, his entire world, his very identity, shattered into a million pieces. Robert took a deep, shuddering breath, visibly wrestling his composure back into place. He pressed a button on a small intercom on the wall. "Maria," he said, his voice firm as iron, "please go to Mrs. Jenkins' rooms and pack all of her belongings. All of them. Have them brought to the front curb. Mrs. Jenkins is leaving us." Eleanor let out a guttural wail of protest, a sound of pure animal despair. She ran to him, grabbing his arm. "No, Robert, please, don't do this to me. I love you. Think of our family." He shook her off his arm like she was a piece of filth. "We are not a family. You destroyed it. You destroyed my son." He looked past her, his gaze landing on me. There was no anger there, only a deep, weary sadness and a startling flicker of respect. "Keisha," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology, a profound one. I let her poison my mind for too long. I judged you unfairly." He then looked down at the first report, the one about Noah. His face softened. "My grandson, my real grandson, my blood." He looked back at me, his eyes clear. "You have more integrity and honor in your little finger than she has in her entire body. You protected this family, the real family." He walked over to a liquor cabinet, poured a stiff brandy, and downed it in one go. Then he turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving the three of us in the echoing wreckage. The house staff, their faces professionally impassive, began to move with quiet efficiency. We could hear their footsteps on the stairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the rustle of garment bags. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, sobbing, her meticulously constructed world crumbling around her in real time. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a hatred so pure, so undiluted, it was breathtaking. "You did this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You ruined my life." "No, Eleanor," I said, standing up and walking over to her until we were inches apart, my voice low and steady. "You did this to yourself. You just used my son to sign your confession." I didn't stay to watch the rest. I took Marcus's hand. He was like a sleepwalker, allowing me to lead him out of the dining room, through the grand foyer, and out into the cool night air. As we walked the stone path toward our guest house, we passed the front of the mansion, and there she was, Eleanor Jenkins, standing on the curb next to a mountain of Louis Vuitton and Goyard luggage. The massive, ornate front door of the mansion closed behind her with a final, definitive click. The wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway began to slide shut, locking her out of her paradise. She stood there, illuminated by the cold, unforgiving light of a single street lamp, a woman with nothing left but her expensive clothes and her ugly secrets, sobbing like her heart had been ripped from her chest. I'm sure it had. I didn't feel a single shred of pity. Back in our house, I went straight to the wine fridge and pulled out the bottle of Cristal we'd been saving. I poured 2 glasses. I handed one to Marcus. He was still in shock, sitting on the sofa, staring at the wall. My whole life, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's all a lie. No, I said softly, sitting beside him and touching his face. The love I have for you is real. The son we have is real. That is your legacy. Not his name. Not his money. Us. He looked at me then, his eyes slowly clearing. He took the glass. A few hours later, Robert came to our door. He looked 20 years older. He sat with Marcus for a long, long time. They talked. There were tears. There was shouting. But there was also the painful, awkward beginning of something new. A bond forged not of blood, but of a shared life, of a love that even a 40-year lie couldn't completely erase. Before he left, Robert turned to me. He looked exhausted but resolved. My lawyers will be in touch tomorrow morning, he said, his voice raspy. I'm restructuring my entire estate. Everything, the company, the properties, the portfolio is going into a new, irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary will be my grandson, Noah Jenkins. You and Marcus will be the trustees. He looked me dead in the eye, and I saw the ghost of the powerful man he was. Thank you, Keisha, for telling me the truth. I just nodded. There was nothing left to say. That night, long after Marcus had cried himself to sleep, I stood on our balcony, champagne flute in hand, looking out at the sprawling dark estate that was now, for all intents and purposes, my son's. I thought about Eleanor. Out there somewhere in the cold, a pariah cast out of the kingdom she had guarded so jealously and so cruelly. She had tried to ruin me. She had tried to declare my child unworthy. She had swung a sword at my family, and in her blind, arrogant rage, she hadn't realized the handle was pointed directly at her own heart. I took a slow sip of champagne. It tasted like justice. It tasted like peace. They say you shouldn't seek revenge, that you should turn the other cheek. But girl, let me tell you, sometimes when someone tries to burn down everything you love, the only thing to do is stand in the ashes of their life and toast to your own survival. The devil works hard, but a mother protecting her child, honey, she works harder. And she always, always keeps the receipts.